I've reviewed a lot of bizarre cases on this channel, but the one that we are diving into today might just be the wildest. The theory is that Vincent Van Gogh, the guy, the painter, he painted The Starry Night, was one of the most notorious, elusive serial killers of all time. At first, I just thought it was somebody trolling on the internet or AI hallucination. It sounds crazy, but found out that there is a book that he has published that exists. This person appears to really believe this theory. The book is called Vincent the Ripper by Dale Larner. And Larner makes an argument claiming that the timelines and geographic locations of Jack the Ripper and Vincent Van Gogh match up in ways that are beyond a coincidence. According to his theory, Van Gogh's whereabouts during the summer of 1888 align perfectly with the gruesome string of the Whitechapel murders in London, which were, of course, Jack the Ripper's murders. Larner says that Van Gogh had the means and the deteriorating mental state to have committed these crimes. Larner takes his argument a step further by examining Van Gogh's actual work and claims that the painter left a trail of hidden clues right in plain sight. They always leave clues in plain sight, right? From strange anomalies and hidden letters and portraits to dates that were supposedly concealed within the brushstrokes. The claim is that Van Gogh was confessing to the Ripper murders on canvas. It's a wild interpretation of art history that turns pieces of priceless art into a serial killer's hidden journal. So, does this conspiracy theory have any evidence that supports it? Or is it just an example of somebody seeing patterns and coming up with a theory? Today, we're putting Dale Larner's claims on trial. Let's look into this theory. Let's get spooky. Hey, spooky people, it's your best friend, Kenny. In 1888, the fog-choked, gaslit alleys of London's East End had a phantom known to history as Jack the Ripper terrorizing the entire populace. You've heard about Jack the Ripper. He was known for brutally murdering and mutilating destitute women in a spree that would define the concept of the serial killer. And he left behind a legacy of terror and mystery that makes his case one of the most popular unsolved mysteries to this day. Hundreds of miles away, in Arles, France, a brilliant artist who was impoverished and deeply tormented, named Vincent Van Gogh, was in the throes of his greatest creative period. He was violently applying paint to canvas, painting beautiful sunflowers and night cafes and starry skies, creating these masterpieces that would become iconic in Western art. Over the last few decades, armchair theorists have accused a variety of people of being Jack the Ripper. Some have said that Lewis Carroll, children's author, was Jack the Ripper, or King Leopold of Belgium could have been Jack the Ripper. It is my opinion that Dale Larner's theory that Vincent Van Gogh is Jack the Ripper is the most outlandish theory that I have seen. He wrote a book that was originally titled Vincent Alias Jack, and it would later be expanded and republished as a set called Vincent the Ripper. He spins a narrative that is shocking and demands immediate attention from everyone. The theory is that Vincent Van Gogh was a struggling artist by day and a serial killer by night. He claims that the words, actions, and geographical movements of Vincent Van Gogh can be matched to the bloody deeds of Jack the Ripper. According to his sprawling theory, Van Gogh's bloodlust evolved alongside his artistic journey. He suggests that his most brilliant paintings were literally fueled by the adrenaline of his murders, providing him with the creative power he desperately sought ahead of the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. Larner's investigation attempts to connect the dots using secret travel timelines across Europe, visual clues that were supposedly embedded in his paintings, handwriting analysis, and dark psychological profiling to declare the ultimate true crime case finally solved. Now, I know what you're saying. Well, this is an interesting theory. That's why you clicked to watch this video. The idea of a mad genius channeling his homicidal urges into priceless works of art is like an unbelievable story. Well, to determine whether the man who painted the Starry Night was the same who was murdering people in London, we have to look at the evidence that has been provided by Larner. The cornerstone of the Vincent alias Jack theory is that Van Gogh engaged in a highly secret commute between his studio art in Arles, France, and the slums of London, England. Because Van Gogh resided in the south of France during the Autumn of Terror, the theory requires him to have gone on a secret and frequent cross-border travel schedule. Larner's timeline begins with claiming that Van Gogh's first murder took place in London in 1873, when Vincent was 20 years old, working at an art dealership. It then says that the Whitechapel spree was the climax of a long career of violence. According to the claims, Vincent moved to the south of France in early 1888, seeking something new in art, only to discover that his muse was serial murder. Larner says that between August and December 1888, Van Gogh made several undetected trips back to London, murdering 7 women under the guise of this newly created Jack the Ripper persona, and 1 additional woman under his standard MO, bringing his kill count to exactly 8 victims. Following his infamous cutting off of his ear at the end of 1888, the theory says that Vincent voluntarily entered a mental asylum specifically to manipulate the director into granting him freedom to roam the countryside, which he used to sneak back into London to kill 3 more women in 1889. There are 2 pieces of evidence that destroy this timeline. The first is that there is an exhaustive paper trail of Vincent Van Gogh's life. Few historical figures in human history have had a more in-depth day-to-day record of their whereabouts, thoughts, and struggles than Vincent Van Gogh. During his time in Arles, Vincent wrote almost daily letters with his brother Theo in Paris, his sister, and fellow artists. And these were multi-page, almost essays detailing exactly what he was painting that day, what specific colors of paint he urgently needed Theo to mail him, and what he had eaten, how much rent he owed to his landlord, and his agonizing state of fragile mental health. To really understand the logistical absurdity of the Vincent Van Gogh is Jack the Ripper timeline, you need to look at the exact dates of the canonical Jack the Ripper murders with Vincent Van Gogh's documented whereabouts and postal receipts. The timeline shows that on the exact dates of the Whitechapel murders, Van Gogh was producing world-renowned masterpieces, writing daily letters, receiving local mail containing money from his brother Theo, and interacting daily with the local postman. On September 8th, the day of the Annie Chapman murder in London, Vincent was writing a highly detailed letter in Arles, thanking Leo for a 300 franc loan and explaining his exhausting 3-night painting binge at the Café de la Gare. Even if you entertain the notion that Vincent forged the dates on his letters to create a perfect alibi, the logistics of this journey make this theory seem impossible. In 1888, the fastest one-way trip from Arles to London would have required at least 24 hours of continuous exhausting travel. A round trip to commit a murder and return to the easel would take a minimum of nearly 3 days of nonstop travel. So to suggest that Van Gogh could completely vanish from Arles for 3 to 4 days at a time, repeatedly over a 3-month period, without his watchful landlord, his daily drinking companions, the postman who delivered his money, and his observant brother noticing a break in his furious painting output, feels like it's impossible. The crescendo of Jack the Ripper's violence was the murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th. And at this time, Vincent was living in incredibly close quarters with Paul Gauguin. The yellow house they lived in was tiny, and the 2 artists were famously volatile, constantly debating art theory, drinking absinthe, and painting the exact same subject side by side. For Vincent to vanish on a 3-day international murder vacation to England in the middle of November without Gogh mentioning his roommate's bizarre disappearance in his own correspondence or journals appears to be impossible. The theory ignores the reality of Van Gogh's finances. Vincent was a starving artist, literally. He lived off a meager, carefully rationed allowance provided by his brother Theo, and he was constantly begging him to buy raw canvas and tubes of paint. International train and ferry travel in the Victorian era was a luxury. An artist who had to barter his paintings to pay his local Café tab had no financial means to have a secret international serial killing campaign. The timeline and logistics obliterate this theory completely. A massive portion of Larner's research relies on the assertion that Van Gogh left visual confessions embedded directly in his artwork because he was so burdened with his crimes. The theory claims that the artist's famous 1889 painting, Irises, contained concealed, detailed images of the face and mutilated body of Jack the Ripper's first canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly. The author claims to have personally discovered these hidden images lurking within the brush strokes, presenting them as a taunting signature of the killer. The theory argues that by manipulating the contrast or tracing specific lines within the floral arrangement, the grotesque visual of the Whitechapel victim is revealed, proving that Van Gogh could not erase the memory of his ultimate crime. Now, the idea of hidden imagery in abstract artwork is a classic hallmark of conspiracy theory mythology. It relies on the phenomenon of the Pareidolia effect, which is the human brain's tendency to perceive meaningful images, usually faces or bodies, in random, chaotic visual patterns. This is seeing shapes in clouds or the man in the moon. Looking at the painting Irises was not painted in the dark immediate aftermath of the Whitechapel murders. It was painted in May 1889, within the first week of Van Gogh's admission into the mental asylum. There, he was allowed a small ground floor studio and was granted access to the overgrown walled garden of the facility. Irises is an observation of the specific flowers growing wildly in the asylum's garden. Van Gogh's signature style involved the furious, rapid application of incredibly thick layers of paint directly onto the canvas. He used bold, swirling strokes, heavily outlined organic forms, and vivid colors of deep blues, greens, and yellows to capture the vitality of nature. When you look at Irises, or really any of his paintings from his late period, the chaotic texture of the thick paint creates thousands of shadows and ripples and abstract shapes. So if you're explicitly instructed to look for a mutilated human face amidst all these swirling leaves and petals, your brain will find a way to stitch those shapes together and find that face. So in other words, it's a textbook optical illusion. The true crimes community's reaction to this claim has been mockery. On internet forums where the visual evidence was proudly posted by the author, users quickly pointed out the absurdity of the method. There's no belief that Van Gogh embedded mutilated corpses of London prostitutes into his floral studies. The claim is a misunderstanding of Van Gogh's art, and it turns his paintings into a morbid game of Where's Waldo. A significant portion of the Vincent Van Gogh is Jack the Ripper argument is dedicated to meticulously matching the words, phrases, and specific handwriting of Vincent Van Gogh to those of Jack the Ripper. It suggests that Van Gogh crafted the Jack the Ripper persona as an artistic performance, a piece of avant-garde theater designed to give himself a uniqueness that he wanted to stand out at the approaching 1889 World's Fair in Paris. It compares Van Gogh's personal letters to the taunting, blood-stained correspondence sent to the London police and press during the murders. Larner argues that the linguistic and handwriting evidence is overwhelming, that the match is absolute. In order to successfully match Van Gogh's handwriting to Jack the Ripper, you first have to have a verified, authenticated sample of Jack the Ripper's actual handwriting. And there is not an authenticated, verified sample of Jack the Ripper's actual handwriting. During the Autumn of Terror in 1888, the London Metropolitan Police, the Central News Agency, and the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee received literally hundreds of letters claiming to be from the murderer. The most famous of these letters was the mocking Dear Boss letter, Saucy Jackie postcard, and the gruesome From Hell letter. And all of these have been heavily scrutinized by experts for over a century. Modern historians, ripperologists, and forensic linguists all widely agree that the vast majority, and most likely all of these letters, were cruel hoaxes. The infamous Dear Boss letter is largely believed by historians to have been completely fabricated by a morally bankrupt journalist at the Central News Agency, seeking to boost lagging newspaper sales by giving the faceless killer a catchy moniker. Attempting to match the handwriting of Van Gogh to a hoax letter written by a sensationalist English journalist is, well, I mean, you know that that's bullshit. And even a cursory linguistic analysis reveals a disconnect between the two sets of writings. Van Gogh was highly educated, deeply philosophical. He was an eloquent writer. His letters were written in flawless French and Dutch, and they are poetic introspective, and heavily focused on the technical aspects of color theory, literature, and the beauty of the human condition. The supposed Ripper letters are characterized by forced theatrical Cockney slang, crude and deliberate misspellings, and a juvenile, taunting aspect. The linguistic profile of the author of the Ripper letters is incompatible with the empathetic, literate tone of Van Gogh's authentic letters. And comparing handwriting styles is already considered a pseudoscience in many legal contexts. Applying it across different languages, using believed to be hoax documents to accuse a man who is verifiably painting in a different country is extreme confirmation bias disguised as some sort of forensic science. Okay, so the timeline's impossible. The handwritten analysis and other analysis is shaky and bad. What does the theory say to explain the murderer's motive? Well, Larner's thesis is on a very specific assumption that Van Gogh's bloodlust evolved alongside his art, and that the sheer terror of his murders provided the power and emotional depth he needed for his paintings. The theory points to Van Gogh's unsettling masterpiece, The Night Café, painted in September 1888, as a subconscious confession to his crimes. The theory argues that the painting's jarring, sickly red and green palette and Vincent's own intense written descriptions of the work are undeniable evidence of a murderous, psychopathic state of mind. Now, it is true that Van Gogh wrote intensely about the Night Café, and his words are dramatic. In letter 676 to Theo, dated September 8th, 1888, Vincent explained his vision. I've tried to express the terrible human passions with the red and the green. The room is blood red and dull yellow, a green billiard table in the center, 4 lemon yellow lamps with an orange and green glow. Everywhere it's a battle and an antithesis of most different greens and reds. In the characters of the sleeping ruffians, small in the empty high room, some purple and blue. Larner, desperately searching for a serial killer, says that phrases like terrible human passions in the room painted blood red seem like a smoking gun. But the context here completely dismantles this interpretation. Vincent was not painting a murder scene, nor was he projecting a subconscious desire to kill women. He was painting the interior of the Café de la Gare, a cheap, all-night local lodging house run by his acquaintances. In the same letter where he mentions blood red, Vincent explicitly explains his motivation for painting the scene. He was annoyed at the landlord for charging him so much rent money, so he decided to revenge myself by painting the filthy old place to get the exact value of his money back in the form of his art. The terrible human passions Vincent referred to weren't homicidal urges. They were the realities of alcoholism, vagrancy, loneliness, and despair that he witnessed among the local drunks and the prostitutes who slept slumped over on the tables in the cafe simply because they had nowhere else to go. He viewed the Night Café as a dangerous, tragic place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime. This interpretation shows Van Gogh's profound empathy for the marginalized and the broken. Jack the Ripper viewed the lower class as prey to be hunted in the streets. Van Gogh identified with them. His artistic ethos during his time in Arles was built around capturing the inherent dignity, the suffering, and the tragedy of the working class, the peasants, and the outcasts of society. The grotesque idea that Van Gogh needed to travel to London to butcher women in order to fuel his art is contradicted by his actual methods. Vincent's power didn't come from bloodlust. It came from an obsessive, manic dedication to observing the beauty of nature and capturing the fleeting essence of life. To reduce his genius to the byproduct of sadistic serial murder is a gross mischaracterization of one of history's most deeply felt artists. To establish a long-term pattern of psychopathic behavior leading up to the infamous 1888 Whitechapel murders, the Vincent Van Gogh is Jack the Ripper theory claims that Van Gogh's murderous habits began much earlier and spanned multiple countries. The theory claims that Vincent traveled in secret from Paris to London in 1887 and committed another brutal murder, officially attributing a real, highly publicized historical event, which is the discovery of a woman's dismembered torso floating in the River Thames, to Van Gogh. It claims that while he was living in Paris, Vincent murdered an ex-girlfriend of his brother Theo, who refused to leave his apartment. To dispose of the evidence and solve Theo's domestic problem, Vincent supposedly dismembered her and deposited her body parts in various street places across Paris. This claim is pure historical fiction. There is no documented evidence, no police record, and no rumors in the Parisian art world that Theo Van Gogh was ever involved in a sordid scandal regarding a murdered ex-girlfriend, much less that Vincent Van Gogh was the hitman who murdered and dismembered her and hid her in the streets of Paris. The relationship between Vincent and Theo is one of the most documented and studied sibling dynamics in art history. Theo was an upstanding, highly respected, successful art dealer working at a prestigious art firm in Paris. He supported Vincent financially and emotionally throughout his entire adult life. The idea that this devoted bourgeois art dealer actively colluded with his unstable brother in the butchering and cover-up of a Parisian woman is a baseless fabrication designed solely to reverse engineer a necessary serial killer origin story for Vincent Van Gogh. The 1887 Thames torso mystery is a real, sensationalized, unsolved murder in London involving dismembered body parts recovered from the river. Attributing it to Van Gogh requires mental gymnastics. During 1887, Vincent was living in Paris, deeply immersed in the bustling Parisian avant-garde art scene. He was going through a shift in his painting style, transitioning away from the dark, muddy tones of his early Dutch period and embracing the vibrant, inspired colors of the Impressionists. He was focused on revolutionizing his painting, not slipping seamlessly across the English Channel to dismember women and throw them off London bridges. Beyond the impossible travel schedule, the fabricated missing timelines, and the optical illusions in the paint strokes, the largest thing that blows this theory up is the psychological chasm between Jack the Ripper and Vincent Van Gogh. Criminal profilers and historians classify Jack the Ripper as a lust murderer, driven by a deep-seated violent misogyny and an uncontrollable compulsion for an anatomical mutilation. Jack the Ripper struck in the dead of night, operating in utter silence, eviscerating his victims with butcher-like precision and melting seamlessly back into the shadows of the East End. His crimes were acts of domination, hatred, and terror directed at vulnerable women. Vincent Van Gogh's severe mental illness showed itself in ways that were completely opposite to Ripper's predator style. Vincent suffered from severe manic depression, which was likely exacerbated by temporal lobe epilepsy, chronic alcoholism. His inner demons did overwhelm him. His violence was almost exclusively directed at himself. When the tension in the Yellow House finally broke on the night of December 23rd, 1888, Vincent didn't attack, nor did he find some random woman to attack in the street. He took a razor to his own flesh, severing his own ear in one of the most infamous acts of self-destruction. Also, there's no evidence that shows that Vincent hated women. He was a lonely, alienated man who desperately sought domestic comfort, family, and affection, often finding it among the very class of destitute women that Jack the Ripper hunted. During his earlier years in The Hague, Vincent famously took in a pregnant alcoholic streetwalker and her child, caring for them, providing for them with his meager funds, and drawing them with empathy and respect. To suggest that a man who viewed the downtrodden with this type of reverence was simultaneously slicing their throats in the London fog is, or seems like, a psychological impossibility. The theory that Vincent Van Gogh was Jack the Ripper is a great example of modern conspiracy theory thinking. It relies on the deliberate misinterpretation of artistic expression and a total disregard for the physical constraints of space and time. To believe this fringe theory, you have to accept that a penniless, highly respectable Dutch artist with fiery red hair, who was chronically reliant on his brother for every single scrap of food and tube of paint, managed to finance and execute multiple international trips on slow-moving trains and ferries. You have to believe that he accomplished this exactly on the days he was proven to have been painting renowned masterpieces in the south of France and writing highly detailed, mundane letters to his family about the cost of furniture. You'd have to believe that he kept this a perfect secret while living in a tiny house with Paul Gauguin. And you have to believe that he entirely abandoned his deep empathy for the marginalized to become the most notorious misogynist butcher of the Victorian era, only to encode secret confessions in floral paintings at a mental asylum months later. The historical record provides an alibi for Vincent Van Gogh. The dates don't align, the logistics are impossible, the psychology is contradictory. The evidence presented by Dale Larner is circumstantial, historically inaccurate, and forced. The urge to link the greatest unsolved true crime mystery with the greatest artistic tragedy of 1888 is an understandable impulse of modern storytelling. It makes sense to come up with such a wild theory to sell books. Vincent Van Gogh was a man who looked at a dark, terrifying world and desperately wanted to fill it with light. Jack the Ripper was a man who looked at the world and brought only terror and darkness. The case attempting to link them as the same person is closed. Please subscribe to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Please like and share this video. If you'd like to support the channel, you could become a member of this channel. I appreciate you considering that. You can also support me by continuing to watch, like, share, and hype up my videos and leave a comment. And I do really appreciate you watching my videos. And please stay spooky.